Hi, my name is Amelia Lyons. I'm the Clinical Supervisor Trainer at Aneurin and Bevan University Health Board. Now, today I'm going to talk about moral injury, moral distress, and definitions of terms, really, how we feel when our values are violated, how it impacts us psychologically, and how to address it. So those are the main aims of today's presentation. So Jonathan Shea, a psychiatrist who worked with Vietnam veterans and worked with veterans, I believe, for most of his career, originally coined the term moral injury, albeit that this kind of thing has existed ever since, humankind has been at war and so on. So it's kind of very old on one level, but these terms evolve to keep up with how they feel in the current times. Now, Shea defined moral injury as a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority, i.e. a leader, in a high-stakes situation. Now, by high stakes, we mean when serious physical or psychological harm is a likely outcome of the situation. Shea also spelt out the need for leadership to be expert, ethical, and properly supported. Now, here we can see the links between moral injury and leadership, and the fact that people may be carrying out orders that they feel uncomfortable with, but in a high-stakes situation, and then later have feelings about. Now, we might then contrast the Shea definition here with moral distress and moral injury as they apply in the health service from the sort of later BMA and RCN reports in these areas. So moral distress being a more lightweight form of moral injury where individuals can't follow through with what they believe is right because of organisational or institutional constraints. And then you've got moral injury occurring where this may happen on more than one occasion or where the situation is much more acute and distressing. Here, the kind of leadership isn't really mentioned, so I guess we can assume that it's on the ground and people making decisions on the ground. But I think this relates to a later slide where how does the more senior leadership and the junior leadership on the ground kind of link up in these injurious situations, and also the time lag between the two. So what might other examples of moral distress and moral injury be? And every health professional, in my opinion, will have faced most likely many of these situations. So certainly in my past, I've seen members of staff refuse patients admission because of having no available beds or very few available beds, and they don't think the person is ill enough, and the thresholds for illness are then increased so that people get refused where previously they would have had treatment, and that can feel difficult to implement and apply when what's going on are cuts in spending and it's the health professional is having to refuse people treatment where they wouldn't have chosen to do that. Inadequate staffing levels, perhaps managing on a ward with inadequate staffing levels and having to deal with the dangerous situations that might occur. So in mental health, that could be having a number of patients on the ward who kick off as such all at the same time. There not being enough staff to deal with that, and staff ending up getting assaulted on your watch. And that's not an uncommon situation in mental health. End-of-life care in general nursing, where perhaps different members of professional staff have different views about when somebody should be put on an end-of-life pathway, for example. So there are a number of issues, and I'm sure that any health staff watching this will think of further issues where they've had to face and had to apply rules that they haven't felt comfortable with. So moral injury can occur as a result of a lack of power or agency. For example, you're a very junior member of staff and you're not the person making the decision, but you may disagree with the decision. Or structural limitations, such as insufficient staff, but you have no control over that, resources, training, or time. You'd like more time, for example, to address the treatment of the patient. You'd like more training. You feel you'd like more training. You'd feel you'd like more resources available for the patient. You know exactly what those resources are, but they are not being provided. So the impact can affect our core values. And how do we then deal with that? So again, just coming back to another way of looking at how we define morally injurious events. So they might be, if we were to sort of group them, something that you've done or failed to do, something that somebody else has done or failed to do, something that you've witnessed, or something that you've learned about after it's already happened. And there is this kind of time lag too that can happen where people may feel something or not feel very much in the situation when it's taking place, but afterwards, they get and develop further feelings and further perspective really on the situation. And depending on how that is, that may ease or exacerbate the kind of suffering that they then begin to feel as a result of the event. Okay. Now, far be it for me to come in between Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway, but let's distinguish between moral injury and other kinds of violations. So if we were to look at, for example, an extramarital affair, an extra relationship affair, on the one hand, one party may feel extremely betrayed, and on the other hand, the other party may feel extremely guilty and ashamed. And there may be a whole range of feelings that are happening there. And indeed, in all the other sort of listed ways that human beings might sort of cheat on each other and lie to each other and so on. So the key is in the high stakes, saying what are the high stakes? So we're talking serious psychological or physical damage or injury to a person, that's the consequence of whatever's happening. And that's the measuring stick, if you like, between what constitutes moral injury versus the kind of everyday regular lying and cheating that people do to each other. Now, it can have profound feelings for us. It can leave us with feelings of guilt, shame, betrayal, anger, moral disorientation. All of these things in terms of concern for the patients and not being able to deliver, feeling constrained by a lack of resources, a lack of staffing, all sorts of things that will leave the individual themselves feeling that deep sense of guilt about the situation. And whilst it's not currently a mental health diagnosis in and of itself, it will lead to people feeling depressed, burnt out, even suicidal, and certainly accounts for a proportion of the health staff facing health problems facing the NHS today, including retention. So in this diagram, we make the distinction between me, the health professional, carrying out my daily job, as it were. Then you've got your organisation, and then you've got the system. So in situations where governments, for example, make cuts to the health service, and then as it works its way down through the bureaucrats, you've got senior members of health services making decisions about where those cuts should be implemented. And then eventually it works its way down to perhaps the ward manager making the decision about whether to admit a patient or not on a Thursday afternoon. Have they got the beds? Is the patient sick enough to come into the ward? And depending on the resources available, they are then forced to make a decision. So in this case, it's not the organisation or the system that feels guilt and shame. It's the individual who's admitting that patient or deciding what kind of treatment that patient is going to get in the here and now. They are the people who are going to feel the guilt, the shame, the wish that they could offer more alternatives, and so on. So the bigger systems and organisations don't feel that. So when Shay talks about, ethical leadership, then we talk about moral injury at the very individual level. You can see the relationship between the two. So, whose morality are we looking at here? And then how does the individual themselves actually process that? And it's likely more often than not that the responsible individual will probably take excessive responsibility in those situations and carry the burden quite heavily. Now we can therefore see that it does threaten retention in an already shrinking workforce. We can see that the issues need to be taken seriously, and both the BMA and the RCN recommend additional systemic work to be taken to address it more systematically and more fundamentally. So the BMA recommends that staff and that support is enable staff to talk privately in confidential spaces about how they feel, to develop support networks, and to develop a more open and sharing culture. And the RCN makes quite a few systemic recommendations around this area, saying that occupational health services need to be available to support the psychological and physical well-being of staff, that employers need to recognise the effects of this on staff and to act to get there, to prevent those issues and to get there sooner, that they should fund timely interventions and counselling and other forms of support for staff, that staff need to raise concerns, need to be able to self-refer to services, and that the professional voice must drive decisions. Now, in terms of that driving decisions around moral injury, it's difficult if there are not resources provided. So it's how then does the professional voice link up with the political and economic decisions about having to cut resources when people are very sick and then don't get their treatment does not get addressed. So this, it leaves us in a cleft stick in that sense, and there isn't an easy answer to that. Now, Dr. Sophie Redlin has done some interesting work on moral injury, and she's also done an interesting Churchill Fellowship on First Nations approaches to health and how those kind of link together. And so in relation to moral injury, she argues for running things like talking circles, looking at professional identity and themes in that area, themes of self-forgiveness and post-traumatic growth. So in an Iron Bevan, where we are looking at this in the form of some initially retreat days for health staff, then we're focusing on professional stories, professional identity, exercises in self-compassion, forgiveness and letting go. So that's just as a start. It doesn't remotely address the systemic issues that bring about moral injury, which is a much bigger question. But on a small scale, we're looking at working with health staff to support their well-being and mental health in this area. Now, there are a range of treatments which the RCN recommend, none of which I would disagree with here. But I think the systemic issues are the bigger ones to get at, but far more complex. On the ground for individuals, sometimes when individuals feel guilty and ashamed about things that have happened, that tends to silence them. And really, we need the opposite to happen. We need to be able to have safe, private and confidential spaces to be able to have an exchange and get the fresh air of sort of almost public scrutiny, really, to ease the burden that individuals are carrying and kind of share it around and get perspective through talking and listening to other people and seeing how what their experiences are. So at the individual level, there are things that we can do. But at the wider systemic level, I think one might argue that it's what the hell are we doing making cuts to any form of health service in a civilized society? Yeah. So our workshops won't be looking at teaching clinicians how to work with this, but merely looking at our own experiences. But it's probably worth saying, because we will have counsellors and psychologists at the workshops, that Shay, who's the most experienced in this area clearly, but from the veterans' perspective, cites three main challenges to bear in mind. One is that the clinician is being made witness to atrocities and depravity through repeated exposure by obviously working with people in this area. That the survivors will experience transference towards the clinicians, and that will be of various kinds, which the clinician will have to tolerate. And likewise, the clinician will experience countertransference towards the individual and go through, if you like, on a secondary level, those kinds of emotions, judgments of self and others, and everything that's involved in this. So it's kind of like working with patients plus. And Shay comments that a well-functioning clinical team can provide protection for clinicians and play a role in successful outcomes for veterans. And to my mind, that's clearly that team will provide first-class supervision for each other on a peer basis. And the importance of clinical supervision is clear in this area, and as much as you need.